The story of the Champollion brothers begins at the foot of the French Alps in the city of Grenoble in southeastern France. At the beginning of the 19th century, the city is one of the birthplaces of the French Revolution. In March 1801, Jean-François arrived in the city. At just 11 years old, he was still a child. He'd just traveled hundreds of kilometers, leaving behind his family and his hometown of Figeac in southwestern France, to meet up with his elder brother, Jacques-Joseph, who had found work in Grenoble.
His mother couldn't read or write. There were 5 children. Jean-François was the youngest. His parents weren't concerned with educating him intellectually. It's his brother, Jacques-Joseph, 12 years older than him, who took on the role of their absent father. He stepped in as a father figure. And as an educator, he was very strict. So strict, he watched him like a hawk, constantly. And he definitely sensed that his young brother was exceptionally gifted.
Jacques-Joseph was working as a businessman, but he was truly passionate about books. He taught himself ancient Greek and was an expert historian. He wanted the best possible education for his little brother.
Very quickly, Jacques-Joseph Champollion started his own private library. There were works by classical writers, but there were also works in the languages of the Orient. So Jean-François Champollion began his work digging through them. He devoured books and spent countless hours working. He studied the books in his brother's private library and left him little messages such as, "Can you find such and such a book to help me further my research?" Because he was so hungry for knowledge.
Jacques-Joseph, among your books, I found several works that I liked very much. I now have questions that I absolutely must answer, especially words related to natural history in the Bible. You wouldn't happen to have any books that discuss natural history in holy books?
If we had to describe Jean-François Champollion in today's terms, he'd be considered an intellectually gifted child. And when we look at his trajectory and then his personality, the term suits him perfectly. At school, he was a poor student. He had very bad grades. However, when it came to studying his favorite subjects, namely the languages of the Orient, he'd throw himself into it heart and soul for hours on end.
In Grenoble, at the beginning of the 19th century, the city's elite would meet up and socialize with the prefect inside the town hall. Jacques-Joseph, the older Champollion brother, was among them. Tales of adventure and travels to faraway lands would fill the rooms. Joseph Fourier, who hosted these gatherings, was one of the greatest scholars of the time.
Jacques-Joseph didn't attend these high society parties alone. He took his younger brother with him. In 1802, he was 12 years old, and his big brother took him along to another of these parties where they both met Monsieur Fourier, the prefect.
In 1802, Fourier was appointed prefect, or governor, of the Isère department, headquartered in Grenoble. He was 34. He produced a great body of scientific work. For example, we owe a series of signal processing equations to him, things we're still using today, in fact, for our telephones and computers. He knew Napoleon Bonaparte personally. Napoleon Bonaparte knew him and liked him. So in 1802, the glory of Egypt surrounded him like an aura, because he held a prominent position at the Egyptian Scientific Institute.
As a result of this meeting, Egypt hit the two Champollion brothers like a ton of bricks. Because Joseph Fourier was fascinated by the land of the pharaohs. Several years before their meeting, he was one of the scholars who turned all eyes in Europe to the magnificent wonders of this faraway land. On May the 19th, 1798, Joseph Fourier took part in a top-secret expedition, setting sail from Toulon, a port in southern France. This military expedition, whose aim was to allow France to control its trade routes in Egypt, was led by the young and ambitious general Napoleon Bonaparte. The general took 167 scholars and scientists with him. They made up the Commission of Sciences and the Arts. Along with Joseph Fourier, there were mathematicians, chemists, botanists, and architects.
In a way, this was the culmination of the Age of Enlightenment, because the work these scholars and artists were to carry out in Egypt would be absolutely exceptional. They studied every nook and cranny of the country. They studied it from every angle. They studied its history. They studied the Egypt of their day. They studied the flora and fauna, the minerals, everything, absolutely everything. It was extraordinary.
The work carried out by Joseph Fourier and the scholars from the Commission would produce a veritable inventory of what exists in Egypt. However, it was still impossible to decipher the writing of the ancient pharaohs. This civilization remained elusive, like a strange and distant dream. A friendship developed between Joseph Fourier and Jacques-Joseph. In the company of this specialist of ancient Egypt, the elder Champollion brother dived headfirst into this civilization, which dated back thousands of years. It was the beginning of the 19th century. All eyes were on this country, and more scholars were fascinated by the hieroglyphics. But this ancient writing still remained a total mystery to them. Jacques-Joseph Champollion had an incredible idea. What if his little brother, this extremely gifted child, could crack the code and breathe life once again into this ancient writing and reveal the meaning that had been lying in silence for centuries?
The archives contain documents showing that Jacques-Joseph was in contact with researchers, trying to understand where Egyptology was at that moment and to learn more about research being done on the hieroglyphics. We see how he was preparing everything so he could hand it over to his little brother and get him started on this project.
In the autumn of 1807, at the age of 17, after 3 years of studies at the secondary school in Grenoble, Jean-François Champollion arrived in Paris. He was finally going to be able to focus on what fascinated him the most, studying rare languages. Within the historic halls of the prestigious Collège de France, he devoured books and grammar manuals.
On Mondays, I leave for Collège de France at 8:15 and arrive there at 9 o'clock. I have Mr. de Sassy's Persian class until 10. Right after my Persian class, I go straight to Mr. Audran's class. We spend 2 hours discussing the languages of the Orient, translating from Hebrew, Syriac, Chaldean, or Arab.
Champollion's professors were the most renowned linguists, like Sylvestre de Sassy, who had been trying in vain to decipher the hieroglyphics for years. Since Bonaparte's expedition, intellectual circles all across Europe were focused on Egypt. The race was on to crack the code. Heine in Germany, Ackerblad in Sweden, and the man who was to become Champollion's greatest rival, Thomas Young in England. The young Champollion decided to give it a try. Within a few months, he and his brother had mapped out a plan, a veritable strategy designed to enable Jean-François to decipher the hieroglyphics.
Studying the correspondence between the two brothers shows us how they designed their process together. And although Jacques-Joseph, the older brother, was not as intellectually gifted as his younger brother, their discussion was truly scientific. In other words, he offered to help him test his hypotheses and to work with him to help him progress so he could work faster.
Don't get discouraged by the Egyptian text. A letter will lead you to a word to a sentence, and a sentence to everything else. Always work in a way that will let me check your work myself.
From Grenoble, Jacques-Joseph guided and oversaw his brother's work. Following his advice, in the spring of 1809, Jean-François went to the Church of Saint-Roch in Paris. Inside the church was someone who would open new doors for him. The vicar of this church spoke an ancient Egyptian language, born centuries ago along the banks of the Nile River. He spoke Coptic.
The Copts, Christians in Egypt, still use this dead language today in their liturgy. It's been extinct since the Middle Ages. But it's none other than the Egyptian used by Thutmose, Ramses, Tutankhamun, which has somehow managed to make it through the ages. Basically, Coptic is the Egyptian language in its most ancient form.
Starting at the age of 18, he really took great interest in studying this language so that he could speak it fluently, as he said, as if it were a living language, even though Coptic had been a dead language since around the 17th century, or spoken only in tiny areas of Upper Egypt.
Dear brother, I'm working and I'm entirely focused on the Coptic. I want to understand Egyptian like my French. I'm speaking Coptic by myself. It's truly the way to get this pure Egyptian into my head. I think Coptic is the most perfect and most logical language known. I hope to be able to create some of it for you when you come to Paris.
It's good that you're focusing on the Coptic, but don't forget about the papyruses. The subject requires your utmost attention, but I'm sure it's possible to understand them.
After this, I'll tackle the papyruses, and with my heroic valor, I hope to figure them out.
In addition to his study of Coptic, Jean-François began researching the different types of writing used by the ancient Egyptians. Because writing was synonymous with power within this ancient civilization. Only the elite, the scribes, could fully understand these symbols. The Seated Scribe is one of the masterpieces in the collections at the Louvre Museum. Throughout the centuries, this character has been staring at visitors, reminding us that he knows the secret of the hieroglyphics.
Power and writing were more closely associated in Egypt than anywhere else. Power in Egypt resided in writing, because writing makes it possible to carry out rites related to the gods and operate the administrative machine. The Egyptian elite was an administrative elite. Nobility was administrative. There was no higher honor than to be able to read the hieroglyphics and to know the secret of the hieroglyphics. It's really what characterized the Egyptian civilization compared to its neighbors.
The writing room at the Louvre houses religious, trade, and administrative documents. Produced by scribes writing quickly, the hieroglyphic symbols became simpler.
For us, the hieroglyphics represent the writing of reference, and it was the same for the Egyptians. They called it Midyu Necher, the word of God, so it was essential. Clearly, such elaborate symbols, you have vultures, owls, and so on, can't be used in everyday writing. Consequently, these hieroglyphics were used in a very simplified manner that's called hieratic writing. Hieratic writing was the handwriting used by the scribes for documents of daily life. The difference between hieroglyphic and hieratic writing was the same as the difference between professional printing and personal handwriting. If you objectively compare a handwritten letter and a printed transcription of it, you'll clearly see they're completely different. Here it's exactly the same thing.
So for thousands of years, the ancient Egyptians used not one type of writing, but two: hieroglyphics and a simplified version called hieratic. Later, in the 7th century BC, a third type of writing appeared, called demotic, which evolved from the hieratic form. At the beginning of the 19th century, these changes remained a mystery for Champollion and all his competitors trying to decipher the hieroglyphics. No one really understood how these three types of writing were related. Jean-François Champollion wasn't the only one interested in this. Across the English Channel, inside the British Museum, his English rival, Thomas Young, was working relentlessly.
Thomas Young is Champollion's biggest rival. He's been described by colleagues as the man who knew everything. He made very important contributions to the field of light, vision, energy, even musical harmony and Egyptology.
Thomas Young was focusing especially on demotic writing because he had direct access to a key document discovered a few years earlier in the Nile Delta, which included this writing. In July 1799, in the small city of Rosetta, the French lieutenant Pierre-François Xavier Bouchard uncovered a stone engraved with three types of writing: Greek, hieroglyphics, and demotic. The lieutenant realized immediately that he was looking at a unique document.
They realized immediately how important the Rosetta Stone was, because they could read Greek. And written in Greek, it says that this text was to be published with three types of writing in all the temples of Egypt. So they could read Greek, and it's the first time that they had a bilingual text. And they thought that since they had a bilingual text, they just needed to compare the Greek words with the hieroglyphic symbols, and they'd be able to decipher the hieroglyphics.
Several copies of the stone were quickly produced using a lithographic process. Among scholars, news of the French discovery of the Rosetta Stone was extraordinary and spread to all the European capitals. But the course of history would change the stone tablet's destiny. During the Battle of the Nile, the British destroyed the French fleet. Bonaparte's troops were now stuck in Egypt. And in August 1801, the last of the soldiers and the scholars of the Commission surrendered to Her Majesty's troops.
And there was a problem, because the English wanted to seize all the documents, including the Rosetta Stone, which was in Alexandria. So there was far more than a negotiation, a confrontation between the scholars and artists on one side and the British officers on the other. The British wanted to take everything. The French didn't want to give up anything. The British had understood the importance of the Rosetta Stone. They were relentless. They were going to let the French keep all the documents, but they were going to take a few things, including the famous Rosetta Stone, which was immediately brought to London on a British ship.
As soon as the stone arrived in the UK, the king felt it necessary to put his name and put a royal dedication on the stone to make absolutely sure that everybody understands that it was taken by the British in Egypt from the French and that it's dedicated to the British people. It was a triumph over the French. It's a symbol of the victory over the French in Egypt. The structure of having the three scripts is, of course, reflecting the culture of the time and the society of the time. Egypt was, in the 2nd century BC, a very multicultural society with Greeks and Egyptians and many other foreigners living together. So it's a way of reaching out to all those different language communities.
Written in 196 BCE, during the reign of the pharaoh Ptolemy V, the Rosetta Stone describes the honors that must be bestowed upon the leader in the country's different temples. The first version of the text is in Greek, which at the time was the language of the political elite. Just above it, the same text is presented in Demotic, the everyday language of the people. Lastly, the third version is written in hieroglyphics, the sacred writing that's thousands of years old. More than 10 years after its discovery, this stone tablet was not the much-anticipated key to unlocking the secrets of the hieroglyphics. Despite the efforts made by scholars who worked on copies, no link was identified between the Greek text and the version written in hieroglyphics. Young, and of course Champollion, decided to focus on the Demotic version, thinking that perhaps the key lay in understanding this third type of writing on the stone. In the summer of 1822, Jean-François Champollion decided to use a new method to study the Rosetta Stone. He had just obtained one of the 3 copies of the stone tablet that were produced in Egypt after its discovery.
This document that we're currently looking at is one of the 3 copies that were produced on the stone itself in 1799. It's a unique copy made by using a lithographic process. They inked the stone as if it were a printing press, and then pressed the paper onto it, which produced this negative of the Rosetta Stone that's currently on display at the British Museum. The symbols are white.
Using one of these copies, Jean-François decided to employ a very simple technique used by linguists since the 17th century, which surprisingly had never been used on the Rosetta Stone: counting.
By counting the symbols, he notes that there are 1,419 hieroglyphics compared to 86 words in Greek. So, if each hieroglyphic represents just one single idea, like a very intricate puzzle, how do 1,400 ideas turn into just 86 words in Greek? It's because the writing is much more complicated than that.
This is one of the ways that helped him understand that the Egyptian language uses a 2-tiered writing system. It's both phonetic and ideographic. In French and modern languages, we have a purely phonetic system. It's alphabetic. One letter represents one sound, so there aren't a lot of letters. The Chinese system, however, is where a symbol represents an idea or a word. They use ideograms, and there are thousands of symbols. Egyptian writing is somewhere in between.
Certain hieroglyphics are phonetic and just represent sounds. Here, the owl is associated with the letter M. The role of others changes depending on how they're used. This symbol, when used alone, is ideographic and represents the idea of a house. But when it's combined with other hieroglyphics, such as in this case, a mouth and legs, it becomes phonetic and represents the sound pair, in the formation of the word peri, which in ancient Egyptian means to go out or to go up. Obviously, at this stage, it was all still a mystery to Champollion. But in sensing that the system may be two-tiered, he made a major breakthrough. He decided to focus first on the phonetic symbols, to try to build a reference alphabet. But how? His knowledge of Egyptian history sparked his intuition and led him to have a very useful hunch. Perhaps the key lay in the name of the pharaohs from the 32nd dynasty, also known as the Ptolemaic dynasty, because these pharaohs weren't Egyptian. Since the time of Alexander the Great's conquests in the 4th century BCE, Greek elite reigned over Egypt. These kings were crowned as pharaohs, and they adopted the same gods as the Egyptians, but their language was Greek. For Champollion, one thing was perfectly clear. In order to write their Greek names in hieroglyphics, they could only have used the alphabetic symbols that represent sounds.
His intuition was amazing. Champollion very quickly realized that the leaders like Ptolemy and the queens Cleopatra, Berenice, all had Greek names, and so they could only transcribe the consonants alphabetically.
They would try to transcribe their names so that the Egyptians would be able to pronounce them correctly. Ptolemy isn't a word that means anything to an Egyptian. It wasn't about translating the meaning of Ptolemy for an Egyptian. Only the sounds were translated. So only the letters with sounds were used, and this would enable Jean-François Champollion to begin building his first collection of letters and matching symbols that he continued to refine and extend little by little as he analyzed more and more names of foreign pharaohs.
Now he could forge ahead. On the Rosetta Stone, Champollion had access to his first cartouche with the name of a king. He knew from the Greek version of the text that it was the name of King Ptolemy. By comparing the hieroglyphics with the leader's name written in Greek and in Demotic on the stone tablet, he succeeded in linking the symbols with the sounds and getting his first series of letters.
Whenever anything was published, or he knew someone had just returned from Egypt, he combed through the documents looking for whatever inscription may have been found. He was eager to get more inscriptions to help him progress, in the hope that one of them would lead him to another breakthrough.
On one document the Egyptian Commission scholars brought back, he noticed another royal cartouche for a Greek pharaoh.
Using the images as clues, he tried to work out the sequence of the inscription. He started by counting the letters and trying to see which ones were also used in Ptolemy's name. And what name could that be? It was Cleopatra.
His method worked. He now had new letters. He needed to work even harder. This notebook, which has made its way all the way to us, shows this relentless and all-encompassing collection work he carried out in the summer of 1822.
We're at the heart of his work. Very quickly, we see that we've got a collection of names like Alexander, Ptolemy, Nero, Berenice, Cleopatra. Just hearing all those sounds gives you an idea of the number of sounds he had to collect, and we see how he kept adding to his alphabet.
Day after day, Jean-François was making progress. But up until now, he had only worked on the names of Greek pharaohs. So he had only analyzed phonetic symbols. He hadn't yet translated any of the picture symbols that represented things or ideas. Everything changed on the morning of September the 14th. On September the 13th, Jean-François received some documents from his architect friend Huyot, sketches representing bas-reliefs from the Abu Simbel temple. These sketches were extremely important because they came from a temple that was built well before the Greek pharaohs arrived. So these royal cartouches had to include ideographic symbols. Jean-François quickly focused the name of a king. Looking at these symbols, he used his knowledge of Coptic. He started with the hypothesis that the first symbol was ideographic and that it represented the sun.
The first symbol is the sun, so that's Ra. He knew it was Ra in Coptic. Ra is the Coptic word for sun. Then there's a symbol with 3 fox furs sewn together that looks like a fork. He didn't know what this symbol meant. And the last one, which really comes from the Rosetta Stone, is a sort of stick. It appears at the end of the Greek name Ptolemaios, Ptolemy. So he knew it represented the letter S in Greek. So on this cartouche, he had a logogram, a symbol representing the sun, and he can read it because he knows Coptic. Then an unknown symbol and an S.
So he's got a Ra and an S. And he thinks, okay, some symbol in the middle. What could it be? Which Egyptian pharaoh's name could it be? Ra, S? Maybe it's Ramses.
He was getting closer to reaching his goal. And once again, his knowledge of Coptic would work wonders. Champollion was looking for the sound M to make the word Ramses. A word in Coptic caught his eye. The word mise, which means bring into the world. He used this word for the symbol that was missing and could now read Ra, mise, S. Most importantly, he now knew what the word meant. Ra, the sun, brought him into the world. With this stroke of genius, he was the first to shine light on what this writing meant. Extremely excited, he now had to test his hypothesis. He tried out his method on another royal cartouche. He managed to obtain Tot, Mes. The god Tot brought him into the world. He had just read the cartouche of the pharaoh Thutmose. His method worked. He had cracked the code.
It was really the birth of Egyptology. Using Coptic, discovering the language, translating a royal name for the first time, this was just amazing.
He had access to the names of the Egyptian pharaohs in the same way that they themselves did, with their own meanings. He put aside his understanding of Greek and did what he'd always wanted to do, let the Egyptians speak once again in their very own words.
A few years later, Jean-François Champollion's nephew recounted the minutes that followed the discovery. An account that will give rise to the legend.
I've got it!
Such an important discovery couldn't have happened in an ordinary way. It needed something extraordinary. So it's very easy to imagine Jean-François running into his brother's house and saying, "I've got it," and then fainting in front of him. It's possible. At any rate, it's great.
News of Champollion's discovery spread quickly in intellectual circles everywhere. And across Europe, newspapers were reporting on this major breakthrough in the quest to crack the code of the hieroglyphics. Louis XVIII himself was aware of his discovery. To the general public, Champollion had become the Egyptian. To be absolutely sure he'd won the race, Jean-François knew he must test his method as fast as possible on site in Egypt. His first goal was to complete and verify the history of the Egyptian dynasties. But most importantly, he wanted to prove to the world that his method of deciphering the hieroglyphics worked. So far, he had only been able to work on a few documents taken essentially from temples of Greek pharaohs. He had to prove that his method worked on all hieroglyphic texts across all the ages. In August 1828, Champollion and the members of the Franco-Tuscan expedition landed in Alexandria. The culture shock struck him, and he shared his initial reactions with his brother.
On August 18th, I arrived in this land of Egypt for which I've been yearning for so long. It seemed like a completely new world had appeared before us. Ruckus, yelling everywhere, mixed with the squeals of women and half-naked children. Oppressive dust, and here and there, some magnificently dressed lords, deftly handling beautiful, elegantly equipped horses. This is what they call a street in Alexandria.
Champollion adopted the customs of the people of the Nile. In this painting by one of the members of the expedition, Jean-François looks more Egyptian than ever.
My shaved head is covered with an enormous turban. I'm completely dressed like a Turk. A lovely moustache covers my mouth, and a wide scimitar hangs at my side. The Arabs all take me for one of their own.
But this exotic life hadn't made him forget the real reason he was there, and he needed to work fast, because he had only 17 months to implement the enormous program he had devised for himself. First, the boats had to go back up the Nile. Their first stop in the royal city of Thebes had to enable Champollion to look for clues. Next, the ships had to make it to the Second Cataract and enter Nubia, so that the scholars could reach the great temples of Abu Simbel. During the return trip, carried along by the river's current, the members of the expedition would study dozens of temples. In less than a year and a half, Champollion wanted to see everything and produce as many sketches as possible. Even with thousands of miles separating them, his brother was by his side.
The letters he wrote to his brother when he was in Egypt are really a travel diary. Each time he describes what he sees, what he feels, how he wants to study it, what his projects are. The scientific project was really present throughout these letters, but so were his feelings. We're with him in Egypt.
The morning of November 20th, the wind, weary from wearing us out for 2 days, allowed me to finally land in Thebes, the oldest of all the cities in the world. For 4 whole days, I ran from one marvel to the next. We, the people of Europe, are Lilliputians. No other people, ancient or modern, has ever taken the art of architecture to such sublime heights.
At Thebes, Champollion entered the great royal temples of Luxor and Karnak. Because he could now decipher the hieroglyphics, these monuments became history books he could read page by page.
It's easy to imagine him in Karnak, seeing all these names of kings written everywhere, on all the columns, on all the decorative columns, on all the temple walls, and saying, I've got to pull this all together. Karnak is a godsend for any Egyptologist who wants to study the dynastic successions.
For 4 days, I've already collected some very important documents. For example, I'm certain that our entire 18th dynasty must be redone. From the monuments, I've also collected a ton of other Ramses that make up the 20th dynasty. I'm sending you this so you don't go hungry. If I had to give you every detail of what I found, I'd spend my time writing. Make do with what little I can send you whenever the Egyptian ruins let me come up for air.
One of the requirements of the time was to establish the Egyptian timeline, verify the dynasties, and provide a confirmed date for these dynasties. So they all needed to be organized, each in relation to all the others. What was transcribed in Greek needed to be transcribed again back to the Egyptian names of the kings. It was an enormous amount of work, gigantic.
Champollion now knew that the inscriptions from the temples in Thebes would enable him to verify a great many of the dynasties and the chronology of the pharaohs in the Middle Kingdom. All his thoughts now turned to Abu Simbel, because he knew from the accounts of the first explorers that this temple, built during the reign of Ramses II, housed important texts. He sensed that it was there that he'd be able to prove to the world that his deciphering system really worked. After weeks of sailing, colossal statues over 20 meters tall appeared suddenly out of the desert.
All his struggles to understand came to a head at Abu Simbel. He was there to test his own hypotheses. He was there to provide the scholars of the world with definitive proof that his system worked. So the personal stakes were quite high.
The discovery of temples in Abu Simbel dated back just 15 years when Champollion arrived. The colossal statues were still partially covered in sand.
Upon our arrival, the sand had covered the entrance. We had it uncovered. I undressed almost completely, and lying on my stomach, I crawled in through a small opening of a door. Sliding completely into the temple, I found myself in an atmosphere where the temperature was 51 degrees. The first room is supported by 5 pillars, flanked with as many 30-foot colossal statues representing Ramses the Great again.
At that moment, Champollion knew he was the only man who could let this ancient temple speak once again. The walls were engraved with accounts of battles. The pharaoh Ramses II overpowered his enemies. Making his way to the very back of the temple, Jean-François discovered a large text engraved between 2 columns. Confronted with these inscriptions, a few days later, the code cracker would conduct amazing work that would confirm his system worked. Known today as Ptah's Treaty, this story recounts a dialogue between the god and the pharaoh.
It's a long text with 32 lines that's broken up rhythmically, as the king's cartouches clearly show. Here's an example. The king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Usermatre Setpenre, the son of Ramses, loved by Amun, blessed with life. The same sequence is repeated here, and in his attempt to decipher the text, he focused on what's said in between the repetition of these cartouches. He literally pulled out all the stops to figure out the text, separate the words, identify the words, and then give them a value and ultimately meaning.
Little by little, Champollion gleaned new words between the royal cartouches. In a few days, he brought the meaning of this great treaty of Ptah back to life.
Using this voluminous and eloquent text, he could prove that his system worked. It is hard to imagine how elated Champollion must have been standing right in front of this monument.
Baking inside the temple in Abu Simbel, the last veil was finally lifted. Inside this ancient temple, Champollion provided scholars everywhere with the proof that validated his research. On March the 4th, 1830, he had finally returned to Paris. Jean-Jacques found his little brother in a state of exhaustion after all the months of traveling.
When he arrived in Paris in early 1830, an enormous amount of work awaited him. He was completely swamped, and exhaustion was setting in. And he may have been falling ill as well.
On February the 29th, 1832, he suffered a violent apoplectic stroke. In a matter of days, the code cracker was partially comatose. His brother and nephews described his last moments.
When Jean-François Champollion was on his deathbed, it really seemed like it was a ceremony to prepare him for the voyage into the kingdom of Osiris, for his afterlife, so that he'd be ready to board the boat that would take him to the kingdom of Osiris in the field of reeds.
Here's how his nephew recounted the code cracker's last breath. Ali lifted up his head and placed his hands that were already getting cold on the Arabian costume and the Egyptian notebooks. His half-closed eyes gleamed one last time. While seemingly fascinated, he looked intently at the cherished relics beyond, all the way to Thebes.
He died of exhaustion. He probably caught some sort of nasty Nile parasite in Egypt. Quite simply, he wore himself out. He was exhausted. He died too soon. Everyone all around him was filled with dismay. He'd just given birth to the science of Egyptology, and now it had just died with him. He was still the only one who could read and interpret certain things. Now what would become of it all?
Jacques-Joseph decided to bury his brother in the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris.
After the horrible catastrophe that has struck us, I'm trying to lose myself in my memories, and above all, I need to think about him. To take care of him exclusively. Not one page is missing from the Egyptian grammar book. It's 500 pages of ingeniousness, of demonstrated divination. It's superhuman. One man's life couldn't hold up against such work. There's nothing left to do for myself, his works, his memory. This is what will fill the rest of the sad days I have left to live.